Good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones and here to answer your questions tonight. Journalist, author, broadcaster and publisher Wendy Harmer. The new Minister for Education, Simon Birmingham. Ecologist Paul Ehrlich, who's best known for his controversial warnings on population growth. Businesswoman and founder of the diverse Australasian women's network, Ehrlich. And the Shadow Minister for Finance, Tony Burke. Please welcome our panel. As always, there's a great deal to talk about. Many questions. Let's go to our first one. It's from Alan Forno.
Thank you, Tony. Shadow Minister. If the Labor Party are so opposed to the increase on GST, what do you have in store to balance the books?
Thank you. At the moment, there's three things that we've put down. Which is more at this stage in the cycle than you'd normally find from an opposition. The first is to abolish the direct action fund that the government's got. The second is our policy on multinational tax avoidance, and the third is high income superannuation tax concessions. Now, you put those together, it's more than $23 billion across the forward estimates, in the order of about $25 billion. That's a down payment, and there'll be more that we'll put forward.
It's actually a very small down payment in actual fact, isn't it, compared to what you need to come up with to fund education, health and the National Disability Insurance Scheme.
Well, let's go through those. National Disability Insurance Scheme was fully funded when it was brought in. Gonski funding, you look at the final budget papers that we brought in, we had all the saves that were there. What the government then did on Gonski funding was they abolished the funding for years 5 and 6, but wanted us to vote for the savings measures to pay for it anyway. So that's the way that those measures have gone. On the GST itself, why don't we support it? Because it's regressive. It's unfair. The moment you talk about the GST, people then have a million different things they're going to spend it on. But the truth is, if you do the compensation the right way, most of the money's gone already. When Peter Costello introduced the GST with the compensation, it actually cost the budget $20 billion.
Quick one, are you going to run the line, this is a great big tax on everything? I think we might have heard that one before, but are you tempted to borrow it from Tony Abbott?
It's a tax that hurts people who can least afford it. That's what it does. And by definition, that's what it does. And, you know, you don't talk about needing compensation for a tax policy on multinational tax avoidance. You don't talk about needing compensation when you do something about top-end superannuation tax concessions, because they're already targeted at people who can afford it.
Okay.
The GST hits people simply because they're spending.
Oh, Ehrlich wants to come in.
Can I say, I suppose when the GST was first introduced, or after John Hewson, I think there wasn't that much fear out there, and I think it was quite accepted within the community. I think from my perspective, you know, as the Prime Minister said, we have to put it on the table. And I think for me, who's championing cultural diverse communities, I think one of the things that we need to do is consult with those communities in terms of the impact of potential increase in GST could have.
We should remember it's John Howard that brought it in. John Hewson proposed it.
That's right, but there was a backlash, and then of course when it came, when John Howard introduced it, there was not much of an issue. I
want to hear from the Minister Simon Birmingham. The GST could solve a lot of your economic problems. Well, if you increase it, I should say, to 15%, which is what's being talked about at the moment.
Well, Tony, the GST is just one part of an overall tax reform question that needs to be considered. And when you're looking at tax reform, it's not done to try to necessarily increase revenue per se, but have a look at how it is that you can raise revenue most effectively and efficiently in a way that encourages Australians to work more, encourages business to invest more. They're the types of things you want from a well-structured tax system. And so your starting point in any talk about increasing the GST is indeed, as Tony alluded to, recognising that you have to make sure that lower income Australians aren't any worse off. So were it to happen, you'd have to lift pensions. You'd have to ensure that those on low incomes, particularly those who are paying relatively small amounts of income tax, are compensated through the system. But you want to make sure that overall you're getting a more efficient tax system that is encouraging business to invest or people to work more hours which of course is about potentially bringing down income tax rates. So that's really the genesis of why there's a conversation about tax.
Simon, off the top of your head, can you think of any other tax increase that would actually pay for what you need to spend on health, on education, and on the National Insurance Disability Scheme? Three of the really big spending items that become much more expensive a couple of years down the track.
They are expensive reforms, a number of these areas, particularly the NDIS, and I'd really take issue with Tony's claim that all of these measures were completely funded by the previous government. We all know that there was a big deficit left in place and no real pathway to surplus, and that's something that we've been grappling with as a government since, as to how to rein in some areas of government spending to be able to pay for other priorities, to pay for a priority like a national disability insurance scheme, and to make sure that it's sustainable for the long haul, which is why you have a discussion about whether you reduce some areas of welfare spending, particularly middle-class welfare spending, rein that in a bit so you can spend more on helping people through disability insurance. Or
raise the GST by 5% to 15% and possibly broaden it as well, which is now a pretty active option, is it not?
Well, there are certainly those arguing that you could spend some form of tax reform revenue on areas such as NDIS or education or health. But I really think the starting premise from a tax reform question is not about more revenue, it's about making sure the tax system is efficient as possible, and about making sure, and it's really important to emphasise this, that poorer Australians are not worse off as a result.
So are we in the phase of the debate where you don't mention the three letters GST?
No, no, Tony. I mean, the great thing about the way Malcolm Turnbull is governing and Scott Morrison's adopting the Treasurer's role is we're all happily talking about the fact we've got to have these
what's that
discussions.
thing called that you might put up to 15%?
I mentioned GST in the first answer, I think you'll find, Tony. But so we're very happy to talk about all of these issues. And of course, whatever reforms are taken will be taken to the next election. So people will get to have their say. There'll be proper consultation on any tax reform measures, and people will be able to have a look at how it all stacks up. And of course, in relation to multinational tax avoidance, we're actually taking real action there already. And in relation to high income superannuation earners, we've been open that that is something that will be looked at as part of the tax reform process as well. So we're not jumping away from any of these issues that are up for debate. We're honestly recognising that if you want to have a high performing tax system that allows us to be able to fund expensive areas like disability insurance and education and health, but also be economically competitive, you've got to have the right tax mix. Okay. And we're not globally competitive in that tax mix.
Wendy Harmer, looking wryly at you.
I see a lot of older Australians here tonight in the audience, and they must be looking at us right now and thinking, what the hell happened? How come this country, the richest country, one of the richest countries on earth with this amazing population, cannot afford to pay for education, for health, for penalty rates, for all the necessities of life? Where the hell did we go wrong? Now, to me, it's about that we've sold off the farm, we've privatised everything, we've let the free marketeers in, we've jacked up the prices, and now you're going to tell us how much tax we're going to pay, and you're going to come back with a begging bowl over and over again.
We only ever paid... Wendy, I don't know if you missed it, but governments have only ever paid for health and education and pensions and everything through tax. That's the way governments raise their revenue.
Yeah, but it was always that we could afford it. The difference is now we can't afford anything anymore. We can't afford a road without a toll. We can't afford to build anything without private enterprise. There's nothing left that we can use to raise capital. I sound like an old-fashioned socialist, don't I? But I think most of the older people here can remember that time and, as I say, wonder where we went wrong.
OK, I'm going to bring in Paul Ehrlich. Listen to this. I mean, in America, you'd call this a sales tax. I think they have different ones.
It's a standard right-wing regressive tax trying to keep... What you're doing is following Ronald Reagan's famous Hood Robin program. You know about the Hood Robin program? You steal from the poor and give to the rich. Let me say something nice about Australia. You still have a more equitable society than we have, but you got to watch yourselves. In other words, you got to think about redistribution. You got to think about runaway population growth, where in the US and Australia, you can't keep the infrastructure up with the people coming in.
We're going to come to that issue, and I know it's one of your favourite topics,
All right.
Paul. But Simon, we appear to have flanked you with two people who have very different views on the GST.
I feel sorry for you.
I don't know. I'll be fine.
Are any of those a fair description of the GST?
I'm not sure. Well, I don't think Wendy really went to the GST at all. Wendy's was a generalist point. Paul's point, if you implemented a GST without compensating measures, then yes, it would have a risk of being regressive. That's a simple fact. Which is why you have to make sure
But if it's
that
a fair
if
tax,
you were,
why are you compensating
which is
people?
why you have to make sure that if you're increasing it, because it's a more efficient tax to collect, because it's a tax that might allow us to be more globally competitive at getting more investment,
And-
all of those reasons that you might do it,
And we still
then you
have
would
to work
increase
till we're
pensions.
70? We still
Then
have
you
to
would-
work till we're 70? Is that still on the thing?
Wendy, when we set the pension age, we didn't used to live till we were 70. I'm
Okay.
sure Paul would back that up. But
He certainly would. Now, remember, if you hear any doubtful claims on Q&A, send a tweet using the hashtags FactCheck and Quanda. And keep an eye on our Twitter account for the resulting fact checks. Our next question comes from Alejandro Morris.
Hi, yeah, this is for Paul Ehrlich. Hans Rosling, a well-known Swedish statistician, stated that based on decreasing fertility rates and advances in agriculture, it's predicted that by 2100, the world population will plateau at 11 billion. Do you still maintain that the world population will be a major problem?
I don't maintain it will be. It is already a major problem. For example, even though there are some people who would claim that professional deniers of climate change and the danger in climate change, and they're pimps in the fossil fuel industry, if you think about it for a minute, every person you add to the planet releases more CO2. When they release more CO2, it's a bigger threat, not just to sea level rise. Everybody thinks sea level rise is the big thing about climate change. Actually, no. Our agricultural system is utterly dependent on the distribution, quality, timing of rainfall. All that's changing. We're already seeing changes in the productivity of the basic grains we depend on. So each person you add needs more food, contributes more greenhouse gases, which increases the assault on agriculture, which has to be spread. The agricultural system already supplies something on the order of 30% of the greenhouse gases. So there's just one little example where things are synergizing, and we're setting our kids up for even worse problems.
So, Paul, can I just interrupt you? Because
No, I don't like to be interrupted, actually.
I know that, but that's...
What were you thinking?
I know that earlier on you said I could do that, so I'm going to do it. To hell with that. You have actually maintained, I think there's a 90% chance that our civilization will collapse within 50 years. How do you get to that?
Well, that is a gut feeling. And the reason it's a gut feeling is you can't deal with the discontinuities. In other words, you can see the general trends, but many people, me included, but people who look at it more closely than I do, think the chances of a nuclear war between US and the Russians is bigger now than it was during most of the Cold War. They think there's an even bigger chance of a nuclear war between India and Pakistan, and there, that war itself, using maybe 215 kiloton bombs, would destroy Australia and the United States as a civilization. Who can guess what the odds are on those? You get scared. But on the general trend, I think we'll be very, very fortunate to avoid a collapse. And Ann and I estimated 10%. Jim Brown, who's an energy expert and the world's greatest biogeographer, said you're crazy. There's only a 1% chance of avoiding a collapse when you look at things like energy return on investment and so on. Nobody knows. Jim is willing to work to make it a 1.1% chance. Ann and I are willing to work to make it an 11% chance. But I must say, when I watch the Republican debates, I'm converging on Jim.
Now, you have been wrong a few times in the past, Paul. You'd admit that, wouldn't you?
Look, any scientist or anyone who's talked about the future and has never been wrong wouldn't be sitting on this show.
Can I just mention one to you? 1971, you said by the year 2000, the UK will be a small group of impoverished islands inhabited by 70 million hungry people. Was that just wishful thinking?
No, they're just not hungry, but otherwise it's accurate. The thing that we're most accused of
It's a pretty rich little country, Britain. I mean, it's not that accurate, really, is it?
No.
No.
But if you ask me where I've been most wrong, it was accepting the agricultural economists' estimates that the Green Revolution would not be adopted rapidly by farmers. It was adopted rapidly, particularly by rich farmers. It's today, nobody is sure whether it was a good thing or not. It's much disputed. We were told that the worst thing we said, by the way, some of the predictions in the population bomb were clearly labeled as scenarios, not to come true in the future. But we said the battle to feed all of humanity is over. And they said that's dead wrong. It's dead wrong. 800 million, 795 million people hungry today, about 300 million starved.
I've got to come to another question because there are some people questioning.
You got shills out there, that's great.
Yeah, no, they're not shills. These are people asking questions. Adriana Zarja.
Hi, my question is for Paul Ehrlich. Do you have any regrets about urging developed countries to use their political power to coerce vulnerable countries into drastic population control programs, having heard of the atrocities in India and China?
Yes, definitely. If I were writing Van and I were writing the population bomb again today, we'd write it differently. Sometimes you make mistakes. I think that was a mistake. I don't think the recent thing that the Chinese, are you going to have a question later on the Chinese policy change?
No, please, you can go on. I'm not trying to censor what you say.
No,
here.
that's all right. I think the main problem with the Chinese stopping, I think, their one-child family program is the moral hazard one. That is, the Chinese, it's not going to increase their family size very much. We know now that in the past, they probably would have gotten to the same place if they had not had the relatively coercive program. It's still much debated. But some of the things we did not recommend, we said these are the sorts of things that have been suggested or could be done. A good example is we said in one of our publications that it would be one of the things that might be good if you could do it safely and biologically safely would be to add something to the water supply, excuse my laryngitis, add something to the water supply that would make you have to take an antidote before you could have a baby. And everybody said, that's just terrible, that's ghastly. Ghastly? It'd get rid of the whole abortion problem, get rid of the whole unwanted child problem, make people make rational decisions. It's certainly one of the things that every government must pay great attention to is the size and composition of its population. It's probably the number one thing that should be in government policy. It at least is discussed in Australia. In the United States, you can't even dare discuss it. We talk policy on immigration without saying how many people we want to have in the country. In other words, it's like telling somebody, design yourself an airplane that'll load 100 people a minute. And you say, well, how many are going to fly with? Oh, don't worry about that. We just want to know how many, load 100 people a minute.
But those immigrants, Paul, have to come from somewhere. So they'd be using up resources in another country, wouldn't they? They'd be breathing the air and drinking the water and using the electricity.
The big problem of people coming into the U.S. is they become super rich. And the big problem in the world isn't too many poor people, it's too many super rich people. Okay. But the whole immigration issue, as you certainly have seen in Australia and you're seeing in Europe now, is one of the most ethically charged issues we face as humanity, and we're not facing it as humanity. Just think of this question. Are borders ethical? The distribution of resources on the planet is kind of random. People are everywhere. Are borders ethical? Shouldn't we be discussing the entire issue of where people are, when they should be able to move, and how you handle it?
Well, I'll just make one point. That is, if you open the US borders, your population would be even bigger than 300 million. But anyway, Wendy Harmer wants to jump in.
Actually, I was talking to Paul about that. I remember some years ago reading a textbook which came up with this thought that if the entire world's population was housed at the density of Hong Kong, then the entire world's population could fit on Tasmania. And Paul said that was about right.
Yeah, but it'd be the end of the orange-bellied parrot, so I really wouldn't like it.
Okay, I'm going to just...
All my World Heritage areas have been gone.
But it's kind of interesting, isn't it? I mean, to think about how creative we could be with housing people. That's what I mean.
I find it hard to imagine 7.5 billion people living in Tasmania, but it would be a more interesting place, that's for sure. Let's bring the population issue closer to home.
Right, Tony.
Who could deny that? It certainly would be interesting. Closer to home with a question from Philip Balding.
Australia has 23 million people, not much water and a bit of space. Do you think we are overpopulated? And at least at what stage should we consider having small family policies?
Well,
I'll go to Tony Burke first. I'll come back to you in a minute, Paul.
Sure.
We're going to hear from the other panellists.
Well, I don't think we're overpopulated, but I differ from Paul on the emphasis, and some of this gets to common ground, but the emphasis on number of people. The principal issue for capacity of the planet, and the planet does have capacity constraints, is the way we live. That's the principal issue. And what matters for Australia, I mean, water, the classic example, was having to redesign how we would deal with the Murray-Darling Basin. It was possible for the Murray-Darling to be sustainable, but we weren't doing it that way. In the same way as with pollution, it's possible to have a limit and a cap on pollution. We had one legislated a couple of years ago. It's not there now. The way we live is a sustainability issue. And I think every time we get down to number of people being the issue, we keep missing the point.
Can I just bring you back to the population question, though? Kevin Rudd, your former Prime Minister, talked about a big Australia. Does the current Labor Party have a kind of concept of how big it could be, population-wise?
No, and I had the portfolio. We had a special episode on this program about it when I was working through the issues. And initially, I had an instinct towards saying, well, let's have targets for different parts of Australia. But every time you work through the issues, what would make an impact environmentally, number of people wasn't the challenge. It was whether or not you were using sustainable energy, whether or not you were using your water efficiently, whether or not you were living in sustainably designed housing. Those were the issues. And the challenge for Australia is a whole lot of the steps that we took over the last few years towards those issues is starting to unravel. And that means, yes, you could end up with a situation where we can't sustain a larger population as population continues to grow. But the smart thing to do is to live sustainably. And that involves setting some limits, which over the last 2 years in Australia are limits that have been abolished.
Okay, Dilay.
And I think, I think, listening to you, Tony, I think the politics needs to be taken out of it when it comes to discussing population and sustainability. And I agree. At my place, we have solar panels. I'm very much a believer of renewable energy. And so for me, the population, we need to definitely grow because we have an ageing population. I listen to Paul and I'm thinking, does it mean that we don't grow anymore? Like you don't want people, to give birth and migration stop? So where would that put us as human race? So in terms of population growth, we need to grow it, with some sustainability policies in place. But I think both sides of government or both sides of politics have to come together and put aside some of those political differences and work towards building Australia into a prosperous nation and with proper population policies.
Simon.
Look, I think, I broadly agree with Tony in the concept that, of course, water, which he and I have both spent a lot of time working on in public policy terms, other sustainable resources, how, of course, we grow our agricultural production so that we can feed not just our population, but, of course, as a net exporter of food, feed many more people in our region and around the world. They're all the questions of how you best deal with population pressures. But there's another factor as well.
I'll bring you to the actual question, which was, do you think we're overpopulated, or at least at what stage should we consider small family policies? That was the question.
Well, I don't think Australia is overpopulated, and I don't think there's any need in Australia to consider small family policies, because in the end, we as a country have relatively low birth rates, and we are, of course, a striking example of how you achieve that, and that is you have a prosperous economy with well-educated populations and particularly well-educated women in the workforce. And that is what tends to keep your population down. That's what's happened in China. That's really what has driven profound change there. Lifting of educational standards, lifting of employment and economic opportunity, and that's what changes population mixes. And it's been shown time and time again. And so the real battle is actually you do need to lift people out of poverty and you do need to get them into economic circumstances in the workforce, because that's when they tend to actually self-regulate when it comes to population.
Here's what Malcolm Turnbull said in his maiden speech. Demography is destiny. America's global leadership is reinforced by its strong population. You have to say large population. Does Australia need to get bigger to achieve its destiny?
I don't think Australia needs to get bigger. We make decisions in Australia about our population. We already regulate that because of the way our immigration policies work. So governments choose to grow the population of Australia by taking more migrants in, and that's an essential part given the nature of our birth rate. So we can make wise decisions year in, year out about how many people we can successfully resettle, what is sustainable in terms of the size of our cities, the use of our natural resources, the economic and employment opportunities available to them. All of those rational decisions are made, frankly, by governments of both persuasions in terms of how our population grows, and that's the way we should manage it.
Wendy, apart from putting 7.5 billion people on Tasmania, do you think we need a bigger country?
What about the mainland?
Well, we could all see. The thing is, we could all go on holiday to the mainland then instead of anyway. I'm loving seeing Malcolm Turnbull have this emphasis on cities and how we do things. This is really where the engine is, the powerhouse is. And I don't know how many of you, but certainly live next to people, but certainly I have done in the northern beaches where they say, no high rise, no high rise. But are quite happy to see the consequence of that is to see the bush mown down. And in Melbourne, we've got this, there's a big report on it the other day, this terrible situation where all the market gardens and, the food bowl is being swallowed up by housing. And we do rely on the housing sector, of course, to push growth, but I've always thought it's a pretty blunt instrument the way it is. So I think this idea of talking about cities and how innovative they can be and how we can go up and infill and do things smarter, a well overdue conversation. And I think Lucy Turnbull will be fantastic to head that up.
Okay, I'm going to bring Paul back in. So you've been listening politely to the conversation that's going around the table.
Mostly nonsense, unfortunately.
So the question was, do you think we're overpopulated?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's no question about it. Talk to your ecologists. Talk to Corey Bradshaw, and I just wrote a book called Killing the Koala and Poisoning the Prairies, which is a comparison of the US and Australia's very successful war on the environment. You're destroying your life support systems here. You're working at it really hard. You're also working to become a third world country because your specialization, of course, is to take your raw materials like your coal, which are going to destroy the world of your grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and ship as much of it unprocessed as you possibly can out to the rest of the world. A pile of coal that Australia ships annually would be about the size of that thing there, extending that way all the way around the world and back to here. That's how much coal you dig out of the ground, even though every scientist in the world knows we should stop burning it as fast as we possibly can. If you want a sustainable society, you can look to Australia. The Aborigines have the longest term sustainable society on the entire planet, until we came along, of course, and kind of screwed it up at the end. But they went through 40, 50,000 years of great changes and so on, managed to survive, kept their numbers reasonable. By the way, you're quite correct. If you want to solve the population problem, give women equal rights everywhere in the world, give them equal opportunities, give them access to modern contraception, give them access to safe backup abortion, and the odds are that you'll start the slow population decline.
Guess what? We'll never have sex with men again.
They have sex with men? Oh, God, I wish you told me earlier. Anyway, by the way,
that is one thing we'll agree on tonight.
Yeah. The aging issue is very popular with idiotic politicians in Europe. They think that because there are, as an aging population, they've got to have imports or higher birth rates in order to keep the population young. There's only one way that you can keep the population relatively young, and that is to keep it growing forever. It's the motto, of course, of the faith-based economic system we're all buried in. A very famous economist, Kenneth Boulding, said in 1966, anyone who thinks you can have perpetual growth on a finite planet is either a madman or an economist. You're going to have to stop growth. Look, you've got a brilliant businessman in Australia who's been telling you this for years. Dick Smith, he says, big Australia's a crock, which of course it is. We're already overpopulated here, and this is partly my country. But Dick gets out and says, you got to design an economic system that doesn't grow. And he's absolutely right. And there are some economists. I shouldn't say Dick Smith is absolutely right here.
So who will pay for our taxes?
No, I didn't say that at all. I just wanted to move on to other subjects because we'll come back to climate change and other issues. But you're watching Q&A. Let's move along. The next question comes from Peter Geary.
Yes, I believe our national anthem, Advance Australia Fair, is indeed part of our national heritage, and I am proud to be part of it. For the Victorian Education Department to allow school students to excuse themselves from singing our national anthem because of a religious month of mourning is disrespectful and not a good example to students. Will this incident set a precedent for our future?
Dialay, we'll start with you.
Look, I think I'm a new Australian, if you can call it that. I came here from Vietnam as a refugee, and I have embraced Australia, and I love singing the Australian anthem. I think it was a mistake from my perspective by the school not to include these children into the celebrating Australian, way of life. At the same time, we need to acknowledge the children had to mourn, and I'm sure there was a period that they could mourn in that period. But I think the school made a mistake, and I think it set a precedent, and I think it will divide the community, which, as somebody of refugee background, I want Australia to accept my heritage, my culture, but at the same time, I also embrace Australia and Australian culture, way of life. And I'm sure some people in the audience would disagree with me on that. However, I think, no, they should have included the children into the song.
Let's go to Tony Burke, and we should mention this. What actually happened here, the school principal excused Shia Muslim students from singing the anthem if they were observing Muslims, a month of mourning in which the Shia don't join in joyful celebrations such as singing. Was that wrong or not?
Okay. First thing, since that time, a number of Shia clerics, including one I met with my own local area last Friday, but a number of them have gone out publicly and said they understand what the school was trying to do, but it was in fact unnecessary. So no one should take this as it's sort of infiltrated out through public conversation as somehow this is a broad Islamic principle that they can't be there for the national anthem. And also remember, for the parents who made that particular decision, and the senior clerics are saying they got it wrong, but they still made the decision on the basis that they viewed our national anthem as something incredibly joyful. It was a good understanding of the national anthem that was there, and we shouldn't start to try to shift this as though this was a community that was being all dark on the national anthem. No, they were acknowledging that this is a really joyful part of Australia, and at this point they are in mourning. So I think the debate's got to something that it shouldn't have got to. There was a particular decision made that senior clerics have said, no, got that wrong. The decision was made for the best possible intentions, and I suspect it's unlikely to happen again. But I don't think there's any reason for us to all get angry when, I'm not saying you are, sir, but I'm not around Australia. There's been a lot of anger over this for people who were all acting from the best intentions.
I think it's the school responsibility, the school's fault, and I think the principal. I don't think the children should be the blame for this, that community, because I'm sure, like me, they've called Australia home, and You know, I sing the national anthem every day, every week at my council. So I sing it proudly.
You don't get up in the morning and sing it just spontaneously. Wendy Harmer.
Well, I'm into a bit of soft diplomacy here, I guess. I think that there's been a lot of talk about forcing children to sing the national anthem, which is just absurd, obviously. But I think that it's also incumbent upon us to live up to the ideals of the national anthem, so everybody who comes here wants to sing it, because it is the best song for the best country on earth. So it's a two-way thing, I think. And
You really think it's the best song?
well, you know what I mean. That you want to sing it and you're really proud to sing. It's a bit of a dirge. Okay, no one can remember the second verse.
Yeah, glad.
Second verse is the best.
But you get a bit of a
second
tingle
verse is
when you
fantastic.
sing it. And I really do think, you know, as I say, if we talk about soft diplomacy here, you know, we love our country and we sing it. Everyone who's here will want to sing it with us.
Can I say, oh, you're going to throw
Well, you can, but I want to hear from Simon, who's the Education Minister, so it's something to do with schools.
Yeah.
So, let's hear from him.
Thanks, Tony. I mean, I think every Australian school child should, of course, learn to sing the national anthem. And I would hope, exactly as Wendy put it, that every Australian school child is enthusiastic, as I hope every Australian is, enthusiastic and proud and energised about singing the national anthem. Not because they agree with everything that's happening in Australia at a given point in time, but because overall we are a great country, we're a lucky country, we're a country with an awful lot going for us that a lot of other countries don't have and rightly envy. So we should hope that people do. That said, to this specific case, if there is a legitimate reason in terms of somebody's faith, whether it's of Islamic faith or Jewish faith or Christian faith or anything else, that for a few days or a few weeks of the year, it's not appropriate for them to join in singing or other types of activities, then we should respect that. The school in those sorts of circumstances should make sure the school community understands it and has it explained to them, and that they are equally respectful of each other's faiths and perspectives. Because frankly, that's one of the things that has made Australia the great country it is. That respect for different faiths and perspectives, the people like Di, of different backgrounds and races who have come here. We're an incredibly successful experiment bringing people all over the world to this country. Our anthem should be a celebration of that. In singing the anthem, we should respect it. Now, ultimately, as Tony says...
Do I suspect a slightly different tone coming from the new cabinet?
Tony, I'm sure Christopher Pyne would have said the same things that I just said in relation to this issue. Ultimately,
could you think of other people in your cabinet who might not have that sort of more moderate view?
I think it's a matter once you have the facts before you. And of course, Tony just gave a particularly important explanation.
Actually, Simon? I just... Are you fine?
The heart's beating strong, rest assured. Tony gave a good explanation of the fact that perhaps it was a mistake, because in fact perhaps it was not in teaching with those of a Shia Muslim background to need to absent themselves from singing the anthem. So hopefully the lesson has been learnt if that's the case.
We can always recite it.
That's that's true. You could go and do some other celebration of our country that's perhaps not as joyful as singing our Girt by Sea anthem.
All right, that's enough. Star Spangled Banner, did you have to sing that when you were at school?
We did, but we didn't have child abuse required in those days. We didn't have any religious instruction in the schools. But you got to face something. For our entire history, even if you go back 5 million years, we've been a small group animal.
Did you say religious instruction's child abuse?
That's Richard Dawkins and lots of other people have said that. Of course, if you teach people details about non-existent supernatural monsters and then behave in reaction to what you think they're telling you, that's child abuse. You don't raise your kids that way.
All right, okay. Quickly back to the anthem.
I don't want to be outrageous, but let me say...
Yes, you do.
You have to respect people who want to do that, because we're a small group animal.
That sounded very respectful.
We, on average, for our entire history, have associated with about 150 other people. And now, after millions of years of doing that, we're a very social animal. We've got to learn to live in groups of millions and billions, which means, as everybody sort of pointed out, you got to give some space for other people or you're going to be in a constant war. And so it's something we ought to be discussing all the time. It's really difficult for us to live in groups of millions in Australia and the United States, billions in the world. And so we have to face that. Other people are going to have different views. You got to respect them as long as they're not trying to tread on you in some way. You know, what difference does it make to any of us whether those kids sing the national anthem?
Okay. All right. The next question comes from Lila Milarchik.
Thank you. Minister Birmingham, you and your predecessor have proposed that the extra money delivered by Gonski in some states is not making a difference. In New South Wales, where the state government is delivering the Gonski school funding to schools according to the principles of Gonski, the evidence and narratives flooding in from schools is showing that targeted funding is absolutely making a significant and positive difference for students most in need. So, Minister, I ask you, would you accept an invitation to our schools to see what is already being achieved? And will you meet with the families that fear that life-changing gains of targeted Gonski funding will not be delivered by your government after 2017? Will you commit to funding years 5 and 6?
Thank you. Thanks, Lila, for the question. Look, firstly, I've not said that current spending isn't making a difference. What I have observed is that over the last decade or two, we've spent a lot more in school education over that time, and we have seen many of our international ratings and comparisons go backwards in that time. And so you've got to make sure that when you're spending more, you're actually getting more value for money, most importantly, better outcomes from the students there. So that's the first point that I think is really important to make. In terms of your invitation to go and visit a school, this afternoon I was at Alexandria Park Community School here in Sydney with Adrian Piccoli, the Education Minister, with the principal and other officials talking about exactly what they are doing with the extra money. Because I do want to understand what they're doing on the ground, get a sense of how and if it's making a difference. And if it's making a difference, then of course that should inform future policy decisions. So when you ask a question about years 5 and 6 of Gonski, well, my view is, and I've sat down as well in the job with David Gonski to talk to him about his report and the model he came up with, which is not exactly as was implemented by the previous government, but David acknowledges that, but he's got a lot of good advice to give. I don't want to look at 2 years of funding now because we're 4 years down the track, essentially, running out to 2017 when the current funding arrangement concludes. I want to have a look at what we do beyond that. So that, I would trust, would be more than 2 years because there's no point giving a 2-year commitment at this stage of a cycle. So the discussions that I'm having with Adrian, with other school ministers around the country, and with, of course, the rest of the non-government school sector are about what type of models will work for the future. But it's not just about the quantum of money. It's got to be about how that is used.
Just to stick to the Gonski funding model, which is the idea is to reduce inequity in public schools. Do you get the sense from what you're hearing from another Liberal education minister here in New South Wales that it is working?
Oh, well, Adrian would want me to correct the record. He's a National Party minister. But, okay. But look, I can see that it is making a difference in some schools. Absolutely. Now, of course, it is early days in terms of extra money flowing from this program. But what seems to be the message I'm getting from Adrian and from the school I visited today is that in those schools, what's happening is the principals have got more autonomy. The principals are having greater capacity to be able to direct money to student need within those schools. And yes, I want to see school funding that is needs-based, that directs greater resources to students with a disability, that directs greater resources to students from Indigenous backgrounds who have great areas of disadvantage, or every other category of need that we should consider in terms of how funding is structured.
Simon, can I just go back to our question? Lila, you're the principal of Marylands High. What would the minister see if he went to your school? What would you show him?
He would actually see a number of great improvements over the last 2 years. We have additional expert staff that are working with children that are in need, some that you have just listed off there, many who have had broken educational histories. They need support. We have staff that work with refugee background students to help them. The attendance is improving, engagement, and I could rattle off a whole lot of statistics now. I won't do that, but certainly in 2 years we have seen a significant change for the better for many of our students, and I look forward to that continuing post-2017
Okay,
because
well,
it is
I'll
life-changing.
go back to the Minister on that specific question. So post-2017 is when the funding ramps up. You have to spend a lot more money on it. So do you think if the model works, that is a good idea to spend money on education in that way and the amounts that Gonski sort of set out so that you can actually reduce inequity in public schools?
Well, I think that, like everything we should do in government, it should be evidence-based. And when it comes to school funding, that should be based on evidence as well. And if we are able to build a good case of evidence in terms of the fact that principals with greater autonomy are using this money in a wise way that's targeted to needs and is lifting student outcomes, then that of course helps to make it easier to ensure that after 2017 we actually do get a long, steady program of school funding that helps to build on that program. And that's what I would hope that we're able to do. I will happily make sure that on the next visit that I have some time in New South Wales, Marylands High School, is it? That's right, Marylands High School. We'll make that the next school visit in New South Wales if it's humanly possible. And you can talk us through what's happening there so that when I go back to the Cabinet table to talk about school funding from 2018 onwards, let's understand it's all locked in and guaranteed right through to the end of 2017. So we've got a couple of years to get through yet. But when we get to 2018 onwards, we are able to actually have the discussion beforehand about where it's making a difference, how it's making a difference, and that of course can inform then how you apply funding models in the future to make sure that they work the best for student outcomes.
Tony Burke, you sensing a different tone again from the new government.
Well, it's a different tone, and hopefully the actions follow through. I mean, on Gonski, my advice is do it. You know, you're talking about, every time this is delayed, you get a generation of kids with disadvantage who don't get the resources they need. And yeah, you can always run an argument and say, oh, well, look, money's not the only issue. That's true. But what school has been able to lift itself out without resources being part of it?
I'll tell you, money's an issue at my kids' public school. We had to have a trivia night to raise money for a twin flush dunny. That's what money, this sophistry about, oh, I'm not sure that money really works. Money works.
And
you know.
For everything that's said, you go back to the budget papers, Gonski was fully funded. The savings were there. The pathway was there. It was all fully funded right through beyond the first 4 years. It's there in the budget papers.
It's just not true.
It's there in the budget papers.
No.
You can go through and say, oh, no, it's not in the budget papers, and no one's going to pull them out of their pocket. Can I just say, Gonski was fully funded. It changes the lives of young students.
Okay, all right.
It's the best investment.
Tony, just hang on a second.
Tony, can I get Tony, can I get one clarity from you? So, Tony, one point of clarification. You're the Shadow Finance Minister. Now, Bill Shorten and Kate Ellis over the last few weeks have not given straight answers to this question at their press conferences. Will the Labor Party commit to funding Gonski 2017, 2018 as you're calling on us to do so?
We're in the process now of having to come up with new funding mechanisms.
Hang on, didn't you say just say yes? Just say yes. There's a simple answer.
No. Be in no doubt, and we made commitments about Gonski funding at our national conference. The exact revenue.
Can you just say yes
to
to that particular question?
We are committed to the Gonski principles. Yes, we are committed to the Gonski principles.
And the Gonski funding?
Yes, we are committed to the funding that delivers the Gonski principles. The timing of how we do it...
Why was it so hard to get you to say that?
I'm still not sure.
No, simply because...
Still had a caveat
simply
on the
because
end.
some of the revenue measures to pay for it, that we had in Labor's budget, the government has kept those revenue measures and applied them to other things and said, but Gonski's now gone.
Yes, but if this were your major priority, then you'd find the money, wouldn't you?
Yeah, which we did, and we'll be in a new election within 12 months, and we are committed to Gonski.
OK, all right. Well, I think we've got an answer eventually. You're watching Q&A. It's time to move along. It's time to move along. The next question comes from Ivy Chung.
My question is, with surveys show that only 18% of Asian talent feel their workplace is free of cultural biases and stereotypes. What does Asian mean for Australia? When will the Australian workforce get serious about promoting a truly merit-based culture rather than a culture that is based on skin colour?
Darley.
Thanks, Ivy, for that question. Yes, look, that's something that at Dawn, what we're trying to do in try to drive that conversation around the need for mainstream institutions from Parliament to corporate public service to look at the talent that they have within the organisation and provide them with training and leadership capability to step up to leadership roles. Look, it's a very similar to the gender debate, the gender push, whereby we want to see more women in, on boards in the top ASX companies. I think what we're trying to do through Dawn is to say, look, gender and cultural diversity and inclusive. I think inclusiveness is the key word here, so that everybody within an organisation, within Australia, can actually grow and prosper. Now, 10% of the population in Australia are of Asian heritage. Being an Asian, of course, I want to, promote that. But I'm sure our institutions do not reflect, the leadership of our institutions do not reflect what we have, the population in our society. So I think it's very important, and especially with Australia in the Asian century, as we've had many papers around that, we need to actually build the capability.
Another key word, targets. Are you interested in seeing targets?
Look, I think we definitely have to set a target, and I know that in New South Wales, that at the last, our treasurer, Gladys Berejiklian, set a target for women to enter Parliament, and I think it's, but obviously, I don't. When you set the target, then the argument comes forward with the issue of merit. Now, I don't buy the merit debate anymore, because I think that we're not calling to appoint somebody who's incapable of doing the job. There are many capable women, men of diverse background, of Asian background, who actually can lead, can run an organisation, can be a CEO, can be a CFO, CMO, and so I think target is probably the way to achieve the outcome we need.
Okay, let's hear from the rest of our panel on that. Wendy.
Well, I think very much we want to see the government take a lead in this. I mean, the government has to really, if we're talking quotas anywhere, it's got to be within government, I think, first. We have to have that diversity. We have to have the jobs for people with a disability, and we have to have more women in government. And then I think private enterprise can take the cue from that. I think actually that you might be just perfect for a little job that's vacant at the moment, which is the Australian Sex Discrimination Commissioner.
Oh, is that?
And I think our Disability Commissioner, I think that job's vacant too, Simon.
Simon, are Asian people underrepresented in Australian politics, in Australian life, in Australian business generally?
Yes, you would have to say yes, particularly if you look at political representation. There are far smaller numbers of representatives of Asian background than there are others across the Australian political spectrum, and probably the same at the top levels of business. I haven't done the stats there, but I suspect that's right intuitively, that I think you see a lot of very successful Asian people getting to senior middle management and management roles, but not necessarily filling the CEO spots. And so there is something for us to make sure we do better at. Now, I think some of that comes with time, and of course we now have far more second and even third generation Asian migrants coming through in involvement in all walks of life, and that of course will, I suspect, see many greater breakthroughs. We have some very old significant role models like Victor Chang in this city, who of course were trailblazers in terms of demonstrating to Australians what it is that Asian Australians have to offer, and what it is, of course, that they add to the great multicultural success I was talking about.
Simon, I'm just going to interrupt you because there's a questioner with his hand up. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm an international student myself, and I've been in Australia for a couple of years now. And in fact, I've met Minister Birmingham a couple of conferences before, recently at the Australian International Education Conference. Now, I think the reason why we are talking about this issue is because we love Australia. We wanted to have a very diverse Australia. But I guess, we are focusing too much on the differences instead of the similarities. Because for international students, for example, the reason why they choose to come to study in Australia, and I can say that on behalf of the hundreds and thousands of international students out there, is because we love Australia. And I think for me personally, Australian education system has transformed my life. And I've learned a lot throughout these years as well. So I really appreciate it. But I think that the focus here is that we should be talking about similarities, talking about Australia as one nation, a nation that is built upon immigrations rather than the differences and other things that we have been talking about.
Okay, let's hear quickly from our other panellists. Tony Burke.
Oh, with all due respect to my own ethnicity, Australia has too many white male clubs. Far too many white male clubs. And for different areas, there are different ways of smashing them open. But as long as you believe that merit is not gender-based or ethnic-based, then at the moment what we see across the board is not merit. It can't be.
No.
It can't be merit.
Look, when people give me the argument about merit, I said I can assure you, if you look at our, especially look at parliamentary our parliaments, a lot of the males that are in there did not get there based on merit. I can guarantee you that. That said, I don't want it to be pit against men and women or Asian against white Australians. I think what we need to talk about is an embracing Australia, and as you're right, Wendy, and our political leaders need to take a lead in this. And I know that in the party we talk about reform in the Liberal Party, and for me, I think we need to stop talking about, we need to increase diversity, we need to do this. We actually have to say, OK, this is how we're going to do it. If there's a safe seat, let's put a woman in there, let's then give an opportunity to a woman or a man of a different ethnic background to run for a seat. And I think the Labor Party did that with Jihab Dib in New South Wales.
What about you? Did you miss out on Joe Hockey's seat?
Okay, no. Let's not put it too much on the spot. Actually, let me bring in.
We got somebody there already.
Let me bring in Paul Ehrlich.
I have some special expertise here. First of all, I was born in an incredibly racist nation, and I'm still in a racist nation, but not as incredibly so as it was once. But
with a black president.
That's right. And my technical training, of course, and research area is evolution and genetics. And I can tell you this, that is, if you're discriminating by gender, by color, by race, any of that stuff, you're wasting your time and you're being inefficient. There's not the tiniest shred of evidence that any group of people so classified has characteristics that makes them better to be executives, to be airplane pilots, to be prize fighters, or anything else. There's just no evidence at all for racism or sexism. And if you're practicing that, you're hurting your country. It's that simple.
Does the American experience tell you that quotas or targets is the way to redress the problem?
There are a lot of things we try and change in society. Sometimes, for instance, starting with a law that's unpopular will lead that to becoming a norm in the society. A good example is smoking. In the United States, the first anti-smoking laws were very unpopular. Now, try lighting up most places in the United States, you'll see it's become a norm. So all those things have to be looked at by people who are trying very hard to change things in the right direction. Try it, see if it works. If it doesn't work, change it.
OK, we've got time for one last question tonight. It comes from Ken Silburn.
Thanks, Tony. Just for the panel, we've all been to school and probably had good memories or bad memories. What do you think about your school and how it prepared you for what you're doing now? And what would you like it for your kids?
Simon, I'll start with you as the Education Minister. Did you have a favourite teacher, for example?
Oh, I better give a shout out to Miss Cornsmith, my geography teacher in my final years, who I haven't seen for many years. I've no idea where she is, but hello, Miss Cornsmith.
Did she tell you which is the safest seat to go for?
Geography, not politics. But, so my school, Gawler High School on Adelaide's northern suburbs, sort of semi-rural area, was a great environment to grow up in because it was part of a market gardening district that had second generation Italian and Greek migrants at the school, first generation Vietnamese migrants at the school, a really good melting pot in an area of Adelaide that is far from socially advantaged or economically advantaged, I should say. Socially, I think it's very advantaged in many instances with that semi-rural area. So for me, I think it was largely perhaps a cultural experience, but school, of course, gave me much of the confidence to do what I do today, to be able to sit here and talk to all of you, to understand many of the issues that I deal with, to have an interest in public policy issues, all of those types of things. But I think in many ways you hope and trust that everybody who leaves school ticks enough of the academic boxes. It's the other boxes that you want to make sure people have as well in terms of being good, rounded citizens who want to contribute to society in whatever way they choose.
Okay.
And my school did well there, I like to think.
We'll get the other panellists to just be a little more concise. Wendy Harmer.
Education Minister, I'm meant to be passionate about this topic.
He didn't leave much, did he? Well, I grew up in schools, of course. I started my first school, I was actually in my bassinet because my dad was a rural school teacher. And so I grew up in school and I loved going to school. I just wish for every child that they don't have a parent who's the headmaster. It's a tough life.
Well, Wendy, my dad was a mathematics master. I'm not sure if that's a lot better in terms of credibility, but I tell you what, he was a very good one.
My dad was a fantastic teacher. I wish for every kid that they could have a teacher who was as brilliant as my father.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Tony Burke.
Yeah, Mum was a teacher too, but I had an English teacher who told me that he read a poem out loud every day, which I've continued to do ever since I was 18. And even no matter how busy you are, you can always just take that moment of fiction, which, has had a massive impact on me. For my kids, the thing that I'm happy about is they've all gone to schools where they've been an ethnic minority, particularly through primary school, and been surrounded in that multicultural Sydney where you grow up knowing that you're a citizen of the entire world.
Darlene.
I went to a Catholic all-girls school and Sister Christine, I remember Sister Christine because English obviously wasn't my first language, so I had to learn English. Coming from a dysfunctional family, I had no support whatsoever, so Sister Christine was somebody that I turned to, and I learned how to speak and spell. Or I became a top speller by the time I got to I started school at year 5, so by the time I got to year 6, I was a top speller. But obviously the Catholic upbringing and Sister Christine driving me has probably given me that drive today to set up what I'm setting up is to provide support for young, migrant and refugee kids who don't have that support or mentorship at home or at school. So.
Paul Ehrlich, I was trying to do a count back as to which decade that you went to school. Would I be wrong in saying it was the 1930s?
Yeah, I started in the 30s, which was a time when lynchings were still going on, when it was a nasty country, but I was extraordinarily lucky. My mother got a college degree. She was born in 1907, and she became
That's been quite unusual.
Yeah, very unusual. She was a Greek and Latin teacher, and I refused as a good teenage boy to learn either. I just would have nothing to do with it. But they were able to live in an area which had good schools and had enough money to send me to college. And the idea that, for instance, somebody like me could be a self-made man is just nonsense. In other words, when you hear about all these people that rose, many presidential candidates actually were helped along the way. I could never have accomplished anything like what I have accomplished if it hadn't been for my parents and for the fact that I was able to go to good schools. And that's there's nothing more important than educating your kids properly and hopefully equitably.
Okay, I don't want to embarrass our questioner, Ken Silborn, up there, but he is in fact a highly regarded teacher. I know from what I've heard about you that you've received quite a few awards for your teaching. We thank you again for your question.
Thank you. Can I just make one note? When we were talking about multiculturalism in schools, our school, when we sing the national anthem, it's like being at the football. It's something which we take pride in, so it's nice that it's on the debate.
Thank you, Ken. That's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, Wendy Harmer, Simon Birmingham, Paul Ehrlich, Di Lay and Tony Burke. Thank you very much. Next Monday, we have a very special edition of Q&A. Speaking at the Wheeler Centre's Dying Gribble argument last week, Andrew Denton made the case for voluntary assisted dying. Well, next Monday we'll test those arguments when he joins palliative care specialist Ralph McConaughey and doctor and author Karen Hitchcock, who both oppose euthanasia, Victorian doctor Rodney Syme, who for 25 years has been helping terminally ill patients who want to end their lives, and Anna Lamaro, a woman with terminal cancer who is determined to have a good and conscious death without euthanasia. Until next week's challenging Q&A, good night.